Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Smallville Season 2, Episodes 12 and 13. So, we have an Episode 12 that is to really just be a heist episode, and a heist episode that doesn't really give us a good payout. But then also, we have a mystery episode that ends up being in 13 that doesn't give us a good enough payout either. So, I like the attempt of what they did in episode 13, but like the end result is just me going like, like okay, all right, and me just leaving dissatisfied between these two episodes. Like, so teeing it up, within episode 12, it seems that we have Martha and Jonathan who are celebrating their anniversary, and while Jonathan has so many things planned, Martha's like, well, yeah, we need to scratch all those plans because I need to go to work. I need to work with Lionel. So it seems that Lionel is to not believe in taking holidays or days off. And so, because he doesn't. So we have Lionel who is to be at Luthor Corp, and coincidentally, there is to be a number of men trying to break into Lionel's vault right at the same time when Lionel and Martha are trying to work. So, and I'll get into more specifics via the actual spoiler, but come to find out, everything that's in that vault is nothing really worth all that while. And so it seems that this ends up being a waste of time for the crooks. And so we, of course, have at some point where Clark is to decide to jump this building, like jumping from one building to the other, to try and rescue his mother and try and thwart these thugs. Funny enough, via the this episode 12. In episode 12, we go on to not only have who is he here? Colin Cunningham, who was actually in the Elektra movie. But not only that, in the very beginning of episode 12, we have Lex who's listening to a song on his stereo, and the song that is playing is actually a song from the Ben Affleck Daredevil soundtrack, which is kind of funny. Like, what a very small world where someone is to take this song and reuse it in this episode. And I thought it was like, I immediately, when I heard that, I was like, yeah, this is from the Ben Affleck Daredevil soundtrack. And I thought that was so funny. So, with that said, we now go on to episode 13. So, episode 13 ends up being a mystery episode where it seems that Lionel is to be shot by the beginning of this episode. And it seems that there is to be a number of stories of how it could have been possible that Lionel could have been shot in this episode. We at first heavily focus on Jonathan, and then we start dancing around who else it could have been. Where it could have possibly been Lex, it could possibly be Dominic, or it could possibly be someone else. And so by the end of this episode, we have to go on and realize that, man, this payout sucked for this episode. Just like, so yeah. So either way, we just have to say that it's just about that time to just go into spoilers for these episodes. Uh, I'm hoping somewhere down the road for a good Smallville episode, because I felt that the last rotation and also this rotation of episodes just weren't that good. Um, Maybe the Whitney coming back episode might have, out of these 4 episodes, been something worthwhile watching, but uh, yeah, like we just get a cluster of episodes that are just not panning out as I'd like them to. So, speaking of panning, I think it's about that time to just pan our way into that Devil 5 time territory, because I think it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time we spoil these episodes. So, in the very beginning of episode 12, we have Lex, who is talking to a lackey of his, and so Lex is to ask this lackey why is it that his father had been able to bid under him, or to take this kind of contract, this big contract, and this lackey of Lex's doesn't know. So Lex is like, well, like, if I were my father, like, I would immediately fire you and make it so that no one would ever be able to uh, ever have you work again. But, like, I guess I'm not my dad, so I want you to figure out, like, who or how uh, Lionel was to find out about all this. So the lackey ends up leaving, and then Lex immediately goes into realizing that some flower had a bug inside of it. So Lex, of course, starts to thrash through his entire mansion to find a number of bugs already. So while Lex is listening to the Daredevil soundtrack, possibly, we then have Clark, who enters and is starting to talk to Lex. And the reason for that being is that Clark wants to do something special for Martha and Jonathan's anniversary, because, of course, we have Clark realize that uh, it's an anniversary that they may need to skip, as far as arranging something, because Martha is to work with Lionel, and so Clark is to go to Lex, hoping that it's like, well, maybe I can put something together to uh, help out my dad, so, or help out my folks. So plus Clark is kind of asking Lex, it's like, seriously, like, your dad won't let my mom off, and Lex is like, yeah, like, my dad doesn't believe in holidays. So when Clark is to make his way in to find out this bug situation is going on, Clark is to have used his X-ray vision to find another bug within Lex's stereo, which then Lex dismantles. So when Lionel is to arrive within the Lex mansion, or the Luthor mansion, we have Lex that is to confront in a very cryptic way about Lionel's bugs. And so Lex is to mention that there has been a bug problem, and Lionel ends up cryptically answering Lex by saying, like, well, if you have a bug, call an exterminator. Having Lex not immediately coming forward and saying that he, of course, was to have gone on to have done any of this, and so now Lex will be the wiser and will hire somebody to try to scan through the mansion to find if there's any bugs that Lex did not find. And then also, Lex is going to call somebody to get even with his father by putting bugs into Lionel's office. So we have Lana that is wanting to introduce herself to Henry Small's wife, who is Jennifer Small. And so Lana is wearing this really nice dress and is to show this off to Clark. And so Clark is like, wow, like, all right, uh, like, what are you all dressed up for? And so Lana is explaining that she's going to finally meet up with her possible mother. And so Clark is just like, well, okay, because I guess Clark finally finds out that uh, that Lana is to have this guy be her real dad or her biological dad. So Lana, at some point in this episode, does go to the Talon to talk to Henry and Jennifer, and Jennifer kind of gives Henry a reason to leave, and then Jennifer explains to Lana that, like, you know what, like, I don't want to get your hopes up, but, like, this guy, like, gives up quickly for his pet projects, that at some point he'll give up on you, because come to find out, Henry has two other kids which he never calls, or he never uh, like tries to get like any kind of real connection with them. And Henry was to also give up on his job, and he just kind of works from home. Come to find out, we see in the next episode why that is, because someone had died on his watch. But anyways, I guess we can go through that whole story, because in episode 13, uh, we have Henry, who is to possibly be working on a case, and Henry refuses to work on that case, and Lana is to be curious why. And then come to find out, Henry had a run in with Lionel, and so Lana was to kind of look into that case but not look into it fully, as Chloe's to kind of tell her things. And so Lana's to make the conclusion of, like, well, like, you seriously wouldn't work on this case just because you've had a history with Lionel in the past? And Henry goes on and says, like, well, that's not all it. That the case that Henry had worked on, a guy had, like, died during that case. And supposedly Henry was to find out that guy that he was to be involved with, like, didn't do what he was put in jail for. And so Henry, after that, was to quit his law firm and to work from home. And so that's why he is to go on and be the way he is. So, pushing on. So we have Clark, who of course is to try to win over his parents, and Lex is to be busy making phone calls to a guy who is to have the name Kern. What a crappy name. Kern. And try to put bugs in Lionel's office. So Clark ends up telling Lex that, hey, like my mother is going to be working in Lionel's office, and Lex is to also ask Clark, or Clark is to also ask Lex if it could be possible if Jonathan could take a plane ride or a helicopter ride to Metropolis to surprise Martha. And Lex is like, well, hey, if you give me a minute, like, I'll do you one better. So Lex ends up trying to call off the whole bug thing being put into Lionel's office, but it seems that we have Pine who is to refuse to let this go. And that Pine is to take control and is to put a gun on Kern, and they decide that they want to try and to break into Lionel's vault. Which, here's the thing. We have Pine who ends up using like a freezing agent to try and open up this safe. And the way that he's just spraying all around, it kind of feels like this guy's hands would have been frozen and would have like broken away just like how this save piece does, because he's like spraying all around. It doesn't make sense for this guy's hands to not uh get freaking chopped off here, but somehow movie magic, right? Or show magic, right? So we have, at some point we have Pine and Bishop who are trying to make it into this vault, and they do. They then are to have Martha and Lionel as hostages for this whole situation. And so when it seems that Pine ends up taking over control, because they at some point end up just shooting Kern and dragging him off, we have Lex who ends up trying to call Pine to call this all off, but Pine is like, no, like we've already gone on and gone into stealing a bunch of things, and like this has already gone too far. So really, so we have Clark and we have Lex who go and see Jonathan and explain what they are trying to do for him. And Jonathan is to say to Lex, it's like, oh, you're trying to win me over, aren't you, Lex? And or like you're trying to like do me a favor, aren't you, Lex? And so here's when finally Lex starts to stick up for himself, and Lex is like bent over backwards throughout a number of episodes to try to please Jonathan to have that consistently get thrown back in his face. And so Lex is finally just done with trying to make Jonathan happy because it'll just never happen. So they do not go along with Jonathan going on this helicopter. And so we then have the news break about this whole theft in Luthor Corp. So we have, of course, Jonathan, who is to go to Lex and ask, like, well, hey, like, considering Martha, like, is at Luthor Corp and things might go horribly awry. Lex is like, I know what you want, Jonathan. Like, you don't have to ask. Like, both me and you can both go on a helicopter to Metropolis to see how this is all going to play out. So it seems that Clark's used his super speed, I would have to assume, to get to Metropolis. So Clark is already at the front of Luthor Corp, and Clark is looking for a way in. And so Clark, it seems, is to be stopped by a woman named Maggie Sawyer. And I think I remember that this girl might be reused again at some point in the show, but I can't guarantee that. And but it's kind of interesting, kind of seeing this character here because I think I've seen her, excuse me, in a number of other things recently also. So we have Clark who ends up getting arrested or ends up getting like kind of searched and not quite arrested, but kind of like, hey, like get back by the barrier. Uh, if you would have tried to break into this place, that would have alerted the bad guys, and we would have had to have forcibly needed to break in here. Like, what a mistake. So Clark is to meet up with Jonathan, who is to make it to Metropolis. And when Maggie is to ask, like, well, hey, who are you? Jonathan's like, well, hey, I'm his father, so give him to me. So Jonathan then asks Clark, it's like, well, hey, like, did you, like, assess the situation because of Clark, of course, having powers? And so Clark is like, well, yeah, the only thing that I could assess that I should probably go on and do is I should probably go on to the Daily Planet and I should jump from that to the other building. And Jonathan's like, well, isn't that kind of risky? Like, plus, if anything, if you do break into there, like, you could possibly put the lives of not only you, but uh, your mother and Lionel at risk. So I'm not quite sure that's something that you should go on and try or attempt. So we have, of course, Jonathan and Clark looking on at the situation. And so we consistently have Lex, who is trying to call Pine to try and have there be a quick solution here. And so Lex calls Pine to mention to them about this secret exit, this elevator exit that Pine could use for them to get out of here without anybody knowing. And Pine is to break into the vault and is to mention all the stuff that he is to have found in the vault. And so Pine mentions that there is a bunch of bricks of kryptonite, and there is a octagonal shaped item that he doesn't know what it is, but must hold some value. And so Martha is also noticing that there is some files. One of them is actually marked Clark Kent, and it says confidential on it. So Martha's like, oh my god, like, is Lionel looking into my son? And so Martha tries to look into the file, but Pine is to force her to stack all the files uh, next to all the other items. So we have Pine that is to ask Lionel about the whole secret elevator, and Lionel is to mention it's like, well, I don't know who it is that you're talking to, but uh, like really, if that person is, I don't know what Lionel says about the person, but like we have Lionel that naturally assumes that this is probably Lex that this guy is talking to, and Lionel kind of figures out that Lex was to possibly be the cause of all this. So so Lex is to consistently talk to the heist men, and Jonathan is to overhear something that Lex has said. And so Jonathan makes the conclusion that Lex is the whole reason for this heist even happening. And Lex is telling Jonathan, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm gonna do everything in my power to have the best interest of like your wife and my father. And Jonathan ends up telling Lex as he grabs him, and he's like, well, I'm gonna do the same thing. So we have, of course, Clark that ends up running from the Daily Planet to then jump and ends up crashing through this window, which ends up setting off this sensor that Pine and the thugs are to have. So they end up sending out Nikki, who is Colin Cunningham, to figure out what is going on in the building. So Nikki comes to find Clark, and so Clark is now asking where his mother is. And so I guess Nikki's to go on and tell him. So, because we don't actually see the rest of that dialogue. So Clark makes it into Lionel's office and is to start to uh, take down some of the thugs. He ends up grabbing one character, which I think is Bishop, and chucking it into Pine. But come to find out, Martha is to make Clark aware that there's kryptonite in this room. And so Clark ends up falling over and starts getting sick. So we have Martha who has to make Clark aware that there is a file with his name on it, and so Clark uses his heat vision to try to burn those files. So we have Pine that ends up taking a hostage, and we have Clark who uses his abilities to stop Pine, and so we of course have Maggie that is to realize that the sensors must have gone off to alert the thugs, and so now Maggie is forcibly needing to break into Luthor Corp. So her and her police officers can go on and rescue both Martha and Lionel. So by the time that Maggie and the police officers arrive, Clark has basically dismantled everything and gone on to save the day here. We have Martha, who ends up putting the octagonal shape in her pocket, where later on we'll find that Martha is to put the octagonal shape into this uh, flower bucket, and is to kind of dig the item in there to where no one will see. So we have Martha that reunites with Jonathan, and they end up kissing, and it's great. And we have this kind of very happy moment yet again. And we have Lex looking on at Jonathan and the Kent family again, with this very interesting song playing in the end of all things. So Clark is, or Lex is to be looking on at Clark and asking Clark how is it that he got in there, and Lionel is to mention to Lex that Clark is very resourceful and that he's very upset with Lex for the fact that like Lex didn't really help out much in this situation, and Lionel kind of knows that Lex might have been the result of what was going on in this episode. So really I think that takes care of most of what happens via this episode. And so I think I'm just going to go on and possibly go into the next episode. I'm going to just kind of double check to see if there's anything that possibly is going to be maybe left for me. Maybe not. I don't think so. So let's just kind of move on. So, episode 13. So, in the beginning of this episode, we have Lionel that is talking about how Martha is not to be under his employ, because in the last episode, Martha is to question whether or not she should still be working with Lionel, because she is to realize that because of that Clark Kent file, that maybe she shouldn't. And Jonathan and Clark are like, well, no, maybe you actually should be working with him, because like that's like we're much better off if you are working with him than you aren't. And we also had the one moment where Martha and Lionel had realized that if they died with this scenario, that or within like the Luthor Corp, that Martha had a really bad conversation with Jonathan, and that Lionel had a bad conversation with Lex, and those could be the last things that they were to have said to their loved ones. We also had Lionel, who is to give Martha a watch, I guess, to celebrate their working together. But Martha was very uncomfortable by receiving this gift. And so I guess Martha was possibly going to return this gift, but don't know exactly. But it plays into episode 13. So, anyways, going back to episode 13. So, in the very beginning of this, we have Lionel, who is to turn because he hears somebody. And so Lionel has mentioned that he is to not be uh, feeling that Martha is going to return under his employee. And so he ends up making a phone call to adjust his schedule. And then all of a sudden, someone ends up walking in, and Lionel is to mention, it's like, well, hey, like, I thought the conversation was over. And so all of a sudden, there's gunshots. Lionel ends up uh, falling from this mansion balcony, this indoor, like, kind of little balcony, to then to this table and crashes there. And so we then transition to see Jonathan in his car with a beer and a gun, and they assume that Jonathan is to be the killer of Lionel because he, of course, was to be nearby while this happened. There's a gun in his hand that matches, of course, uh, Lionel's attacker, so on and so forth. So we have Jonathan, who ends up making out of his way of the car, not realizing why he's even there. And so the sheriff goes on and arrests Jonathan, Sheriff Ethan Miller. And so we then go on to have Lionel, who is in the hospital. And so it seems Dominic is to explain to Lex that if there wasn't to be a worker present within the mansion, that Lionel could have died. And so Dominic is to make the assumption that Lex was or should have been the prime suspect in the death of Lionel, or an attempted death, because Lionel may possibly make a full recovery. And so we have Lex that grabs Dominic and is to say that, like, Lionel may be grooming Dominic, but Dominic will never go on to take control over uh, Luthor Corp, because it's always going to be left for Lex. So we, of course, find out that Jonathan is in jail, and so Jonathan, of course, is asking if Lionel's okay, if he's going to make a recovery. And so we have both Martha and we have both Clark that are thinking of, like, well, like, who can we get to be a lawyer to defend Jonathan? And Martha is to think of her father, and Jonathan's like, no, because, like, he's not going to defend me. Like, he doesn't like me. And we, of course, have Clark that ends up thinking of Henry Small, who doesn't like the Luthers anyways. So, but then we find out that Henry does not want to go on and defend against his case, but then come to find out he turns around about it, and then he's like, oh, okay, I will go on and I will defend Jonathan because it's the right thing to do. And then Clark ends up meeting with Lana to say, like, well, hey, like, how did you get him to change his mind, kind of thing. So we have ooh, uh so Man, this is goofy. So, Clark, of course, is to make his own investigation, and the first thing that he ends up seeing is where his dad's car was parked. He finds a bullet that is left in the shed, and so Clark makes the sheriff aware of this, and the sheriff is just like, well, like, maybe your dad, while drunk, could have fired off a shot, or any anything else that uh, couldn't really lead to Jonathan really being like absolved of this crime. And so Clark is like, but yeah, but you can look into this. So Clark is to also head to the bar that supposedly Jonathan had went to and continued to drink a huge amount of alcohol. Supposedly, the sheriff is to say that Jonathan had a 2.0 alcohol level, which of course is well beyond the legal limit. So, because Jonathan is to say he only had like half of a beer. So, Clark is to go on to meet up with this bartender to get his side of the story. And so the bartender had mentioned that, yeah, like Jonathan was getting really drunk and was talking about him hating the Luthers and so on and so forth. And that, funny enough, the bartender in this episode is to actually be a guy named Mike, but the bartender in this episode actually goes on to be the mayor in Superman and Lois. I thought, I was like, wow, that's kind of funny. How small of a world that like this guy is to get kind of like this guest appearance, but he goes on to actually get a role in Superman and Lois, an actual like more legitimate more legitimate role that kind of spans quite a few episodes. So that's kind of cool to have a Smallville connection with one of the characters that went on to be in the Superman and Lois show. Because when we had like Annette O'Toole, who was Lana in a Superman movie, and then went on to be in the Smallville show, that's kind of a like a fun thing where we had uh like the casting just kind of work out. Anyways, so we have Clark that is I think we also have a Lana moment here. Let's cover the Lana moment, because come to find out, Lana was talking to Clark, and so Lana mentions that she had overheard both Lionel and Jonathan arguing, which is to give the sheriff even more reason to just be like, well, yeah, like obviously, Jonathan should be like the prime suspect here, because luckily Lana is to back up that story. So Lana is to mention to Clark that Jonathan and Lionel had an argument about the the day before, while she was trying to she had some like Talon paperwork that she had to kind of work through or something like that. I don't know the exact words she said, but Lana was listening in on Jonathan and Lionel's conversation, and Jonathan was upset because of the whole watch thing that I mentioned in episode prior. And so Lionel was mentioning that it's just a token of uh, his appreciation to Martha working with him. And Jonathan thinks that it was much more than that because how expensive the item was. And later on, we have Jonathan who tells Martha that the reason why he was actually just upset about that whole watch thing was because Jonathan realizes that he could not give Martha something like that as a gift because they just don't have the means for that kind of thing. So yeah, Jonathan was upset, but not enough to want to go on and try to murder Lionel over that. But it seems that it gives Jonathan all the motive in the world. So we of course have Clark that does ask Lana, though. It's like, well, do you think that my dad could have gone on and killed Lionel? And Lana's like, well, of course not. It's like, well, good, because he did. He did, Lana. Like, what? No. So, uh, so come to find out, Lionel will pull through, and so once we finally do get Lana talking to Henry, convincing him to work with Jonathan, we then have Henry, who is to mention uh, that he's like, well, hey, I think we're like this case is gonna do so well that we're gonna go on and we're gonna get Jonathan out of here, possibly by supper time. And Jonathan is to also mention, it's like, well, hey, if Lionel is recovering, then like shouldn't Lionel be able to uh, figure out who the killer was? And Henry's like, well, considering he's blind, like it kind of rules out eyewitness kind of a thing. So we have also where Clark is to go on and talk to Lex, and Lex is probably having his own suspicion that Dominic may be the man who was to kill Lionel, as Dominic was to point fingers at Lex, saying there was a whole disagreement between both Lionel and both Lex, because Lionel was to figure out a way to buy out Lex and take control of Lex, so Lionel and Lex again would be working together. And Lex, of course, would tell Clark, it's like, well, hey, like I overheard a conversation where Lionel was wanting to give me, Lex, uh, like a run of the company, where it realized that Dominic was going to get the cold shoulder. And so they kind of ran this scenario where Lex was to be the killer and then Dominic was to be the killer. And so we're like, okay, like who's going to be the killer at this point? So come to find out, the real legitimate killer by the end of this, we have to cover this scene, but then I'll get to who it actually is. Because we have Clark, who is to go on to go back to the bar yet again to find out that there was a fridge with a body in it, and Clark had found this photo, and so Clark, it seems, is to be figuring out this case, and Pete and Clark are kind of driving around, and so we all of a sudden have this vehicle that is to force Pete and Clark's car off the road, and then we have this shot being fired into Pete's car, and Clark is to realize something is going on. So Pete ends up super speeding, or Clark ends up super speeding Pete out of this car, and is to brace Pete's body but kind of hovering over him to then like protect him from this blast, this explosion in this car. So they're like, well, hey, like whoever was to have killed Lionel must still be out there because they're coming after you, Clark, because you're starting to figure out what's really going on here. So once they get it out in the news that Lionel's health is to be on the up and up, we have the killer that goes on to Lionel's hospital room, and we have the killer that goes on and starts shooting into Lionel's bed. Well, come to find out, Clark was to have some dummy there and was to tell the killer, it's like, yeah, we planned this knowing that you were going to come after him. And so come to find out, the actual killer was to be Sheriff Ethan Miller himself. And I was like, really? Like, they're going to hodgepodge and just try to get rid of this character? And I was like, God, this is so weak. This is so weak. So, come to find out, the sheriff is mentioned, like, hey, you don't know how bad the Luthers are. Because they have to figure out a way to explain that the sheriff, I guess, was light on funds. And so he gave Lionel some information about these certain people that could be helping Lionel in certain certain situations. And so the sheriff is to mention that Lionel is to, or the sheriff is to say that he has information on Lionel that could arrest him, and all he needs to do is make some phone call. And Lionel, it seems, is to be a step ahead of the sheriff, because he is to go on and take that evidence that the sheriff was to have on Lionel, and Lionel has it. And so all of this is to immediately give Sheriff all the reason in the world to come after Lionel and kill him, or attempt to kill him. And so, yeah, like, the sheriff is the villain by the end of this whole story. And so, what a huge letdown. So, after they resolve all this, they arrest the sheriff. There's going to be a new sheriff. I think we end up getting a female sheriff. So, after this is to all resolve, we it seems had Clark go on and go to the Lex mansion and have another thing to have accused Lex of, when Lex could have possibly killed his own father. And it was funny how, like, Clark went on to accuse Lex of possibly killing his own dad, and Lex was to try to, like, no, like, I didn't kill my own dad, but here is maybe another story of what could have also played out. But again, that's another notch on sets 2 so far. where Clark had gone on to accuse Lex of something, and he didn't actually do it. So that's two. Uh, Very funny, right? So for those moments to happen. So we have Clark and we have Lex, who is talking about Lionel, and the funny thing is Lex is to mention that he is going to go on and take on his father after they go on and find out all the heinous things that he has gone on and done uh, to force somebody into murdering him. So we have Lex who ends up talking to Lionel, and we then have Lionel explain what happened between both him and the sheriff, how it was all just a misunderstanding, and they go on and explain uh, how this had led to the sheriff going on and shooting Lionel. So Lax, of course, is uh, to want to let his father know that at some point he's gonna he's gonna get to him. He's gonna figure him out. He's gonna try and do something. And so Lex just kind of walks off with kind of like aha, like it's just a matter of time before Lionel's gonna crumble and fall. Or there's going to be some weak spot that Lionel has. So, with that said, at some point we're probably going to have this chess game finally come to an end, hopefully. So, with that said, I think I'm just going to go on and try to get out of here. These episodes weren't good to explain, but anyways, I went on and explained them. So, with that said, I think I'm also just going to maybe call this a day because, man, lot of a lot of just stuff going on for today. So, anyways, yeah, um, kind of, I kind of bit off more that I can probably chew for my day. So that's what I meant by all that. So I think I'm just gonna go on and get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.